Hi, and welcome to part 2 of the computational action process, understanding users and communities. I'm Nicole Payne. I'm a computer scientist at MIT, and I'm the creator of the computational action process. In the last lesson, we talked about defining a problem that you want to work on that also impacts your community. Today, we'll go into the next step of understanding those users and communities who are impacted by that problem. Computational action is licensed under the Creative Commons license and can be shared for non-commercial use. So let's jump in. First, let's think about why it's important to care about who is impacted. Try to answer this question for yourself for a moment. So why should we care about users and communities? Well, for me, the answer is pretty simple. Understanding the nature of a problem usually means understanding the experiences of the people or the communities who are experiencing that problem. So that's the reason the second part of the computational process is all about getting that full understanding of users and communities. In the last section, you may have chosen a problem like climate action or good health and mental well-being or quality education to get started thinking about what issue you want to work on. But what are these problems attached to? It's attached to people and the users affected. So understanding how these people are affected, how they feel about the problem, what they need, and what their concerns are is really important to getting to the crux of what you will build in order to address that issue. So today you'll get step-by-step tools to use to better understand users and communities. Take a moment for yourself now to rethink about why you feel like it's important to understand the users that you're making something for. Why do you think this might be true? What might you add to this statement, and what might you disagree about? I will present to you an interesting story to answer this question. So what's the big deal about user research? For me, I like to think about the story with Henry Ford, who is shown here on this slide. So Henry Ford, you probably know, created the first car, the Ford Model T. He is thought to have said, if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So why is that true? Well, at the time, the only mode of private transportation that existed in the world were carriages drawn by horses, so cars hadn't been invented yet. Sometimes for public transportation, people would take locomotives, which are trains. Since this is all that existed in the world, it's natural that when a user hears the question, what would you want for faster transportation, they would say, well, I want faster or stronger horses, right? Which is exactly what it is said to have, Henry Ford is said to have said. Now, can you think about why this makes sense that people would say they want faster and stronger horses instead of thinking about cars, and how that affects how we should think about problems? The key takeaway here is that as innovators, engineers, as inventors, you can take user research and create something new, maybe something that people haven't even thought about, right? Or can't even answer if you ask them, what do you want? So for user research, it's really important to think about this. So one, we will ask the right questions. You want to ask the right questions to users. But then two, you want to synthesize or you want to summarize with the answers that they give you, and then hopefully, ideally, create something new that better addresses their needs. So remember, it's up to us to ask questions about, to ask users about their problems, to understand their needs, to really take into consideration their concerns, and then use this information and then analyze it, summarize it, and then perhaps invent a brand new solution for them. When you're doing user research, I really want you to think about staying in between curiosity and empathy. So you want to be curious about your users' needs. You want to be very curious about what they're telling you. Maybe they're telling you parts of their life or how they interact with this problem, or maybe tasks that they do on a daily basis. And you want to be empathetic, right? So you want to put yourself in their shoes. You want to really try to be respectful about what they're saying and really see if you can see the problem from their perspective. So these are some best practices, and I've mentioned some of them already. While you're understanding users, it's really important to ask open-ended questions so that they can fill in their story. It's really important to listen as they're telling you their answers or their stories. It's really good to ask, to not assume that you know any part of their experiences, but maybe ask even the really simple questions. And then you can create a day in the life. So this means thinking about a problem from the perspective of how a user might think about this task or this problem throughout their day, or maybe throughout their week or throughout their month or a year. You want to be respectful, of course, as you're asking user questions, and you want to follow up with relevant questions if they say something very interesting as a response to some of your questions. Here is a cheat sheet of questions that you can use. So I created this cheat sheet of questions to help you frame your own user research questions. You can see there's discovery questions. These questions are more about understanding the nature of the problem or discovering and exploring that nature of the problem. And then you want to understand and dig deeper into the task. So these questions are something like, how would you go about doing some task? Or can you walk me through how you engage with this activity? And then you can add in a showing question if you are interviewing someone in person or maybe virtually. You can ask them to show you how they go through this process, which is oftentimes really helpful. It gives you a lot of data that way. And finally, there's a category of questions more under opinions, desires, or attitudes. Here, you can even ask a user how they would think about a product or a solution, like maybe something that you want to propose. So this activity for practicing user questions is in the Computational Action Toolkit. You can find the template in the toolkit. And on the left-hand side are all the template questions that I wrote out. And on the right-hand side, you can fill out your own questions for your own problem based on those template questions. Of course, you don't have to write a question for every line. You can just feel free to be inspired from the template questions, but you might find that some of the template questions are very relevant for the problem that you're exploring. If you're doing user research in person, which is a great way of gathering data, here's some tips and information for how to do that. So usually a user interview would probably be best around 20 to 30 minutes. You want to interview one user at a time. And you can use all those questions that you wrote down, but just ask them in real time. And if you have people working with you on a team, other people can be observers and note takers, and they can be one main question asker. So of course, you want to remember to respect your user, to be curious and empathetic, and make sure to thank your user for their time at the end of the user interview. Another topic that's related to understanding users and communities is to figure out if there's existing solutions in your community. So oftentimes local organizations and nonprofit organizations, or maybe even schools and libraries, may already be working on something that's very relevant to the problem that you want to work on. You can learn a lot about your project and your solution, or you can get inspired by researching what's already being done. Sometimes you can even partner with them. So it's really important to do this community analysis. In the toolkit, you also find the steps and the ways to do this community analysis, and I'll explain it briefly here. So first, researching local and global organizations. There's many ways to do this research. You can, of course, search online. You can maybe even go to your library or school and talk to people who might know organizations that might be working on the problem that you're interested in. In the toolkit, there's already a form like this where you can go in and fill out what you discover. Maybe fill out the name of the organization, maybe a brief description of what they're working on. And then the next section of the toolkit, you can fill in a bit more detail about what each organization might be doing. And again, this is maybe inspiring for your project. Maybe you want to partner with them and work together with someone else for your idea or your solution. But you can also think about what they're not doing that maybe you want to do in order to address the problem. So this is a good table for you to do this summary, this collaborative analysis of existing solutions that might already be in place in your community. Okay, so let's take a look at a student example. This is an awesome student project made by a team of students just like you. They coded this app called Vividly on App Inventor. And their app, they were trying to solve a problem of better mental well-being for teens. So let's take a look specifically at some of the questions that they did in their user research and how they presented their summary. So you can see here this team interviewed teens, and they asked them certain questions about their mental health, their communication of their mental health with their parents. They also asked them open-ended questions like this question: how did COVID-19 affect your mental health? Open-ended questions is a great way to get a lot of good data. You can see this team pulled out some of the responses that they got. This is a really rich way to get data to inform what you can build to address your users' needs. And also, really importantly, they also asked questions to parents, right? So for your problem, usually there's multiple groups of users. And so here, this team asked questions both to the teens who will be using the app, but as well as the parents who are indirect users of the app. So this is a great reminder that there's multiple user segments and you can ask different questions or the same questions to different users who might be affected by the problem that you want to address. Okay, so some more tips on user research. This team created their user research questions on an online form, and then they were able to send it online to many people and get the responses back. So this is a great way that you can also incorporate into your user research by putting the questions into an online form, or you can even email them or send other links in other ways to people online in order to get responses and get data. If you do an in-person or virtual interview like we discussed before, try to interview one person at a time, but try to interview maybe 3 to 5 people. This will give you a lot of information and a lot of good qualitative information that you can then incorporate into your design of your solution. And you can also, of course, interview friends and family, but remember, the better you know someone, the more biased their answers may be, so keep that in mind if you do interview people that you know. And finally, conducting a video interview can be a great way that allows the other person to share their experiences or share their screen. If it's an online workflow, you can get a lot of information by looking at someone work through their workflow. So you might want to consider conducting a video interview if that's something that you can do. Okay, so last part of the user research section, what do you do with all that data? What do you do after interviewing all those users? Well, a great thing that you can do is to build user personas. So user personas capture the most important learnings from all of the people that you interviewed. It's a great way to summarize those learnings to then inform how you want to create a solution. So in the previous example, you saw the student team do user research with both teens and parents. So those are 2 user personas that naturally arise from that problem, teens and parents. Of course, your user persona segments will depend on the problem that you're working on, but some examples that might occur are teachers versus students or administrators, or parent and child. One fun example I like to say is if you're thinking about an issue around a pet, it could be a pet owner or a non-pet owner, or even the pet owner and the pet. And there's so many examples of different user personas, and I encourage you to think about other segments that might work for your problem from your user research. The main takeaway, though, for a user persona is to try to gather the summary of the user research that you did. So the persona is not one specific person. It's a summary of all the people that you interviewed that fall into a similar segment. So once again, in the previous example, we saw all the teens interviewed and all the parents interviewed, and the team was able to create user personas for teens versus a user persona for a parent based on the user research that they did. What to include in user personas? Usually you want to include the key demographics that make up the user persona. So this could include age if relevant, or gender identification if relevant. You want to include distinguishing characteristics about how they interact differently with the problem space. So again, in the previous example with the student project, you saw that teens didn't want to talk about mental health with their parents versus parents, certainly wanted to hear about mental health issues from their teens. Oftentimes, other categories could be quite interesting to include in a user persona if you have this information. So this can include hobbies of the person, or habits, or likes and dislikes. This gives you a bit more information about the persona. And again, you're gathering this information based on your user research. So if it comes out of your user research, it's definitely okay to include it in your persona. But remember, the bigger goal of each user persona is to write down the key takeaways of this user segment that's relevant to your problem. So we'll take a look at an example of what I mean by that. You can feel free to review these tips for building user personas on your own. Usually, folks probably create between 2 to 4 personas, but usually no more than 4. Oftentimes 2 to 3 are plenty probably for your problem. And make sure that you add, rich detail to your user persona so that each one is distinct from the other. You can definitely feel free to highlight the goals and the problems and the concerns of each user persona. Feel free to review these tips as you build your own user personas. This is an example of what it means to do persona building. This example is also included in the Computational Action Toolkit, so feel free to review that offline, and this should give you some helpful information for how you can create your user personas. So as you go through your user personas, you'll fill out each section. These are 2 examples, but there's also a blank slide for you to fill out your user personas. So again, this is in the Computational Action Toolkit. When you navigate to the user persona section, you'll be able to find this matrix and you can fill it out based on the user research that you conduct. Finally, I want to conclude by saying that one of the really fun things I like about user persona cards is that I can add some more personality to my understanding of my users. So this could include like a fun name that's relevant to the user persona, or it can include a fun avatar to really highlight and give a bit of more of a delightful, fun process into creating user personas. These are cards. Again, they're available in the Computational Action Toolkit. If you go into the User Persona Toolkit, you can edit these cards, you can drag in other cards, you can feel free to use this template or to make your own template. This template is available to you in the Computational Action Toolkit. The final thing I'll say about the user personas is that, like I mentioned, you can use some fun avatars to give more life and more delightful experience into your user persona building. These are available in the Computational Action Toolkit, so feel free to use these. These were all sourced from online sources, or you can create your own avatars, of course, if you feel like doing that. So as a summary, what did we do in this section? We figured out the user questions that you can write in order to understand your users and communities better. We also talked about understanding maybe existing solutions that other people in your community or other organizations might be doing. This could be inspiring for you. You could partner with them, or you can figure out what they're not addressing that maybe you can address with your project. And finally, we talked about user personas, right? User personas is very helpful to summarize the information that you found through your user research into key categories. And you can use these categories to then inform the next section, which we'll talk about design and in the impact matrix. And the user research that you do in this section is really critical, is very important for the next section. So be sure to spend enough time writing your user questions, maybe putting your questions online in a Google form or other online forms so you can get information online from many people, and then summarizing and synthesizing what you learned from your user research into these user personas, so then it'll be very helpful for the next section where we talk about designing and creating an impact matrix. It's totally okay to take a long time on user research. Oftentimes people come back and redo user research if you don't have enough information. So make sure that you spend enough time on this. And again, you can find all of the materials online with the Computational Action Toolkit. So have fun doing your user research, and I'll see you in the next section for design.